Welcome to Tenak Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk Weekly Parsha. With this week, with more Ira Michelson, good friend, love having him on the show. And this week's Parsha is going to be Parshat Yitro. Some call it Yitro, some call it Yisro. We just call it whatever feels like it rolls off the tongue. Ira, my dear friend, it is so good to see you again. How are you?
Doing good. Trying to keep warm here in the very cold, wintry days in Israel.
Is it almost over?
Is it what?
Is the winter time almost over?
No, it's we actually had a very, very hot summer and pretty warm weather up until probably the last month or so. And once you get into January, we get into the rainy season. We just had 2 or 3 days of really intense rain that ended yesterday. And but the weather is we're getting into the really cold weather. We'll probably have it till at least sometime into March generally.
Ooh.
But we only have really... Depends. It's really an interesting country. You never know. I mean, people assume that because Israel is in the Middle East, that it's warm all the time.
Right.
But you have to remember that Jerusalem. I know I've lived in the two places that are, pretty much at the top of mountains, in Tzfat in the north, which is one of the highest elevations in the country of Israel. And Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, is also on a mountain. So we're at a higher elevation. So Jerusalem they actually thought we were going to get snow with this storm, which we didn't get. But
wow.
We can get snow in Jerusalem. It did snow in Tzfat during this storm a couple of days ago. But we luckily did not get snow. So...
Gotcha. Our winter here, I think, is about through, from what I can tell anyway. So, don't know for sure, but it sure seems like it. We had some cold, had a few days where we had a few flurries. Wasn't anything major. My kids were, man, it was weird. The flurries were coming out of the sky, but nothing was sticking, and they were running through the yard saying, "Woohoo! It's snowing! It's snowing!" Yeah, not exactly what I remember as a kid, but okay.
Yeah, well, I grew up north in the U.S., so I remember some of the big snowstorms in the Northeast. It's one of the reasons why I've moved to Florida. So I know Florida. It's funny that actually there were times this year when South Florida had colder weather than we had here in Jerusalem. I would talk to my family, and it was colder there in Florida, where it's typically warm throughout the year, except for maybe a week or two where they get down into the 50s. They actually had colder weather. We're right now in the 40s during the day, and it'll be in the mid to upper 30s tonight.
Be sure to wrap those pipes. That's all I know. Okay, well, I guess without further delay, did I say that? Without further delay? Yeah, that sounds about right. Okay, cool. We'll go ahead and move on into this week's Parsha. And so if you want to, let's touch a little bit back on Vishalach. Of course, next week we'll be moving into Mishpatim, which is going to be interesting.
Right.
So kind of get us up to par, and then you can kind of take off, and I'll follow you along on screen, putting some scriptures up as you need them.
Right. So Bishalach, Bishalach basically is, speaks about the redemption from Mitzrayim, the redemption of the Jewish people from Egypt, where Pharaoh sends them out of the land. And of course, it's the time when they're going out, and it's just so interesting. When I study on Shabbat, and read the Parsha, and I have to laugh about how stubborn of people we are. And it's true when you know anything about Israeli culture. In a lot of ways, we're not much different in our complaints
Okay.
You know, even in just with regular life, I'm not even just talking about people that are, Torah observant, but just in general, the daily complaints we have. And so you can imagine, what it was like, in their time in the wilderness and constantly murmuring and going back and forth with Moshe Rabbeinu, with Moshe about, taking them out into the desert to die. And, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die?
Right.
Whether it was food and, the quail coming for them, or the mun, or what we call manna, coming, and then constantly seeing the divine providence of God for them. When we get towards the end of Beshalach, we have the situation where also it became an issue of not having water. And of course, Moshe has to cry out to Hashem again, to God, crying out about these people. And, it's the time where he's told to smite the rock in order to bring forth water. And then it kind of ends Beshalach with the Moshe sending out Joshua, to battle the Amalekites. And, we know that the Amalekites attacked the rear end, so to speak, of those marching out of Mitzrayim, going after the weak and, those really unable to defend themselves. And as a result, to this day, Amalek is supposed to be blotted out. But I did want to touch on one thing that I thought was really interesting at the end of Beshalach before we move on. And it's this, everybody knows the story about, Moshe holding up his arms during the battle and then getting weary. And it says that they had him sit on a rock, and Aharon and Hur both hold up his arms. And one of the things it says in, trying to look at the verse here, I believe it's verse 12 of chapter 17 of Exodus.
Okay, let me look that up too. You said verse 12?
I believe it's verse 12. Let me see.
Moses' hands were heavy. Yeah, that's it.
ויקחו אבן וישמו תחתיו וישב עליה ואהרון והוא. Yeah, and it says towards the end, the second half, it says, Tamchu biyadav mizeh echad umizeh echad vayehi yadav emunah ad bo hashamesh. And what it's saying there is that what I'm saying is interesting is that word emunah, because we know that word emunah stands for faith. It's actually translated there as steady. That in other words, each one of them was standing on each side of Moshe, Aaron, and Hur, and they were holding up his hands and were steady. It says until the going down of the sun. But the word there in the Hebrew is emunah. So it's almost like he had these faithful hands, these steadfast and faithful hands that he was holding up during the battle. I just, remember, I'm part of the Emunah project, and Emunah is a very big part of my life, and the whole concept that emunah should be a very big part of all of our lives.
Right.
It would be nice if we all had somebody to stand and hold up our arms when we're weary. I can certainly tell you that I have those times where I could certainly use somebody's help.
I think
holding up my arms.
I think what stands out to me in that idea is that a lot of us, when we need help, we're not like he was in that moment where everyone knew his condition at the time. Everyone was there.
Right.
But usually when you and I need help, or maybe maybe I'm just speaking for me, who knows, when I need help, like spiritual help, is like, I don't want anybody to know I need help, and so it's like I isolate that. Maybe if we were more open to not necessarily broadcasting it, but just not so like hiding of it, maybe it would be easier for people to fulfill that role,
Yeah, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing as long as you're not hiding it from the Creator.
Right.
um, the most really the most important thing that we can be are people of truth, and being truthful with the Creator. I mean, this is why the concept of intimate personal prayer, or what we call hitbodedut, having those intimate times of prayer and truthful prayer where you're talking to the Creator as if you're talking to your best friend, and sharing the truth with him, and pouring out your heart to him, and telling him your struggles, not just seeing God as a blessing factory or a blessing machine where you're constantly asking him for things, but sharing your struggles and your pain and your sorrow and your weaknesses, and telling him when you're not able.
Mm.
I think is probably one of the most important kind of relationships that you can have. And then, of course, past that, certainly, if you're able to be honest enough with friends and to have friends like that, it would be great.
Right. So tell me, only because I've had somebody ask me this question before, and I don't really know. Somebody said at this point, did in this week's parsha, in Parshat Yitro, we see where Jethro comes, right? Is there anywhere throughout this storyline of Yitro, whenever, where it declares that he actually converted? Several people have asked me this. They said, when did Jethro convert? He was a Midianite, or whatever.
Right.
And so,
Right.
what is there an easy answer to that, or does the
Well,
Midrash teach anything specifically on it?
well, I mean, it's not going to be a Tanakh only kind of thing. I mean, it's really
Okay.
based on Jewish tradition and Jewish commentary that says that he was at the point of. It's actually an interesting parsha when it comes to that, because there are actually arguments about the chronological order of the parsha, because it's one of the. What's amazing about it is that it's called Yitro, or Yisro, like you said. Like, how in the world does probably the most important parsha of the entire Torah get named after a Midianite priest? When we're talking about the Matan Torah, we're talking about the giving of the Torah at Sinai. We're talking about such a significant part of the Torah. So when I talk about the arguments, like for instance, most commentators think it's set up in chronological order, meaning that it's set up in order of how the events took place. But for instance, Ibn Ezra, who's one of the great commentators, doesn't believe it's set up in chronological order. He actually believes that Yitro came, when it says that Yitro came, that he came after the giving of the Torah, that it's not in chronological order.
Right.
And there's a whole concept of, and that would kind of answer some of it, because it wouldn't, if he did come after the giving of the Torah, then obviously he didn't stand at Sinai receiving the Torah with the rest of the people. And one of the things that Ibn Ezra touches on is the idea of the two sons of Moshe, Gershom and Eliezer. And what he brings is the concept of Moshe at some point, having the conversation with God and asking God that he would not leave Israel without a shepherd, just before, he's ready to go and leave this earth. And some commentators believe that he was alluding to his sons having some kind of a leadership role. Ibn Ezra, in saying that Yitro came after the giving of the Torah, says that the reason why Gershom and Eliezer were not considered for a leadership role was because they didn't receive Torah. They weren't there at the giving of the Torah, and as a result were not themselves, because they had grown up, in Midian, and didn't receive the Torah from their father, that they weren't qualified for a leadership role. So there is no really easy answer, like you said, to that question.
Okay.
As to whether or not, but Jewish tradition does say at some point that Yitro did convert, You can see things within the Parsha that allude to the fact that he certainly changed his perspective and his viewpoint. Even if you look at the very beginning, and I really, we always talk about, I talk about what a great Torah portion this is, and of course you would think we would want to focus on, focus on the giving of the Torah, but I thought that because such a large percentage of your listeners are not Jewish,
Right.
That for me it would be more fun to address the Parsha from that perspective, from the perspective of Yitro being this non-Jewish Midianite priest. I mean, it starts off calling him Kohen Midian. He's still called a Kohen. Kohen is just a general word for priest there. And the father-in-law of Moshe. Two things. Number one, it's usually said, as it relates to the relationship between God and the Jewish people, that this was somehow a wedding ceremony. A lot of people talk about this in a marriage contract. And at first I thought, do I want to go into the whole, God marrying Israel concept? Because I know that there's also always an argument that goes on, did God divorce Israel? I know Tovia has addressed it. Yeah, I've addressed it with Rod. I've addressed it on other shows and things like that. But really, I thought that the more important thing to discuss here was this idea of why it's named after Yitro. Okay. One of the things that we see in verse 9 of chapter 18, after it says that Yitro came and brought Zipporah, the wife of Moshe, and his two sons. In verse 9, it says the first word is vayichad. This is the word in that verse that's talking about him being, I don't know what your translation says. Maybe it would say rejoiced.
Yeah, rejoice, gladden.
Right, gladdened or rejoiced,
right.
For what Hashem had done for Israel. But this word vayichad can really, it really has to encompass much more than just the idea of rejoicing. It really speaks of kind of an extreme reaction. It would almost be the kind of reaction that somebody has, such an emotional reaction of unexpected joy that literally you get goosebumps kind of thing. And that's what's said about Yitro in this Parsha. So of course we see in that he rejoiced as a result of hearing everything that God had done. And it doesn't say that he rejoiced because of what God did to Egypt. It says that he rejoiced because of everything that was done for Bnei Israel, for the children of Israel. Okay, so that we start off with that. Now, when we go into why I think it's interesting that it starts off with Yitro and it talks about the idea of him being a Kohen, is that because when we go further on into the Parsha, like when we go into the next chapter, in Exodus chapter 19, specifically verses 3 through 6, I think it is. I believe it's 3 through 6.
Okay. Let me scroll on down. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called unto him. Okay, let me put that up. Okay, I'm on screen now. You want the Hebrew or the English?
No, it doesn't matter.
Oh, okay.
Whatever you want to put up. I can read the English, is fine.
Okay.
The only thing that I'll say in Hebrew is the specific, very important words that I think they're
nice.
That I'm trying to make the point over, because it says it talks about Moshe going up to Hashem, to God, and him being given instructions to give to Bnei Israel. And this has to do with that wedding ceremony, kind of marriage thing that we're talking about. But he says, thus you shall say to Beit Yaakov, to the house of Yaakov, and tell Bnei Israel, you have seen what I have done to Egypt. So now, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant and be my treasured nation, for all the land is mine, then you shall be for me a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So I think it's interesting that it starts off discussing a foreign priest and then goes into the issue of Bnei Israel becoming a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
Okay. That's okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. I'm just following you. Took me a minute to find the right spot. Go ahead.
What's that?
Oh, I was just trying to scroll along looking for the Hebrew